Well, hi again. We're into our fourth session of the day as the sun sets on this beautiful London skyline. We're joined now by two excellent cameramen who insist on being called cameramen, not DOPs, although actually, technically, I think they both earned the DOP title, quite rightly so. We've got Ed Moore here. Hi, Ed. Thanks for joining us. And Gareth Ward, who are both doing a lot of work in corporates, commercials, music videos, and a little bit of drama. And we want to explore really where they're at in their career and how some of their experience can help benefit us.
So Ed, maybe you could tell us, how did you start on your path to what you're doing now?
Well, I had a slightly roundabout way, a sort of traditional up through the camera department route didn't quite work for me. So I actually worked in theatre lighting for sort of 5 or 6 years on and off whilst I was at school, and then had sort of really not a huge amount of interest in film at that point, but it was still placing lights and kind of working with shade and light and that kind of thing. And then in my gap year before university, I ended up managing to get a job through a family connection at Provision in Leeds, where they shoot Emmerdale, amongst other things. So I was a sound assistant, weirdly now, on Emmerdale for a while, and then I ended up working in the lighting department at Provision. So that was rentals and of all the big film lights. Didn't do camera department at all. It was just lighting. So I kind of learned, translated the theatre lighting stuff into the film lighting. Then at university, I ended up starting a production company with a couple of friends, which kind of grew. We did an awful lot of corporate work, kind of smaller scale corporate stuff, but kind of gradually getting bigger and bigger for about 3 or 4 years. And then I ended up about 3 years ago going freelance as a DP, and on the way done sort of a couple of years as a Steadicam operator as well, but now mostly doing kind of commercials, corporate and that kind of work.
So Gareth, tell us your story, because you're slightly more traditional in your upbringing in this industry. Tell us about how it started for you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think these days, I don't think anyone's traditional anymore. It just seems everyone, comes from some different perspective. I basically did work experience at a post-production house for about 3 months, twice, 2 days every week. Hung out in the coffee section, talking to people, became friendly, and basically they seemed to like me and eventually offered me a job. All I could get into was the tapes dubbing section, so my primary role was to roll off about 200 1-inch tape for commercial release, retail spots and whatnot, and check them all for banding and kind of stuff. Probably the most boring job you could imagine. But the opportunity came up where the guy in their little production department lost his license, and I got 6 months opportunity to move into that role as the studio assistant, camera assistant, and that built up into in-house camera operating as well. So essentially, that was it. I did outside broadcasts as well. They were setting up a new department in that regard, and kind of worked as a camera assistant for about 3 years before I went freelance. Again, following on from camera assisting, but I was very lucky because a DOP, an accredited cinematographer in Australia, actually gave me a great opportunity, and he said, I want to take you under my wing and kind of teach you jib operating and stuff. He had quite a bit of equipment and wanted to teach a young guy to be able to do the jobs he couldn't do. So camera assisting for him, jib assisting, and then eventually operating gave me kind of the teaching and the tuition that I think probably a lot of people are very envious of, that I probably only now look back and think how wonderful it was.
And how important was that? I mean, I think these days it's very easy to be able to buy a camera, a very affordable camera, which produces fantastic images, and they'll shoot with that camera and they'll put their work up online. And what you've had is the experience of working through different departments and that sort of level of apprenticeship.
Yeah, I mean, certainly with this cameraman, it's amazing what you do learn. That even he said to me when I was starting to operate that you'll be surprised how much you actually know. But until you start operating, that's when you start to realise, oh, I'll do that, oh, that's why. So you do take in a lot more than you think you do. It is a great thing to do still, work up the ranks as an assistant, work under people. And one of the biggest things I actually have probably taken from him is also how to deal with clients. Watching him, how he knew what shot needed to be done, what was the best option, but sometimes the clients aren't 100% sure on that, and it's helping guide them there without just directly telling them this is the best way. Most people don't want to be told what to do, and there's a real politics that needs to be played more often than not, unfortunately. But you know, I picked up a lot from him, and unfortunately, the training that we have these days is just not there. I can't vouch for England, but certainly in Australia, the traditional training came through the television studios. You worked as a camera assistant, studio assistant, and you got your training. You shot news. That's you know, you were given 100 feet of film, and you had to shoot and essentially in-camera edit a complete story, and that was your training. Some of the best cinematographers in the world, the Don McAlpines of the world, all started that way. Unfortunately, they don't do the hiring, they outsource, and the training is gone. So to me, the entry-level camera market, combined with, you know, the online video, you know, sites and whatnot that allow people to put up their videos, is the online training, the advice that you'll get these days that once upon a time were done in studios.
Ed, you know, how important is being a good people person in this business? Because, you know, you have the skills to light, you have the skills for the vision and operating cameras, choosing lenses, but it's much more than that, isn't it?
Well, that's just as Gareth was saying, that exact same thing. I think that's what I'm the most envious of about people who've come up the ranks and had that set experience, because it's such a huge part of what we do. I think most you know, DPs, even if you're just starting out, can make something look pretty with, you know, a few lights and a studio and a bit of time. Like, that's kind of not really almost not really the main part of the job, actually working as a DP and trying to deliver images on a schedule. So you're also, you know, as well as being creatively involved in the imaging, you've got this huge department around you. You're kind of the biggest manager on the set. And I had a lot of catching up to do with that, actually, because I came through, you know, you're running your own production company, you just do it however it comes naturally. And the, you know, the clients, we were working with smaller clients rather than, you know, TV ad clients, so they didn't hugely know the difference. So it wasn't really until I started working as a Steadicam operator on other people's sets that you know, I started to learn, oh, okay, you know, this is how, you know, the cadence of a set should operate, and this is how, you know, you set the tone from you know, the producer, director, DP down, and everyone kind of responds to how they treat everyone. So I think, yeah, people management skills is critical. We've all heard stories of DPs kind of threw their toys out the pram when they can't get what they want. I've always thought that seems hugely counterproductive, but it definitely still happens a lot.
And do you find, you know, that you looking fairly young, but with a huge amount of experience, is that challenging at all at any time when you go on set?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it can be. I have had times where I've gone on set on a, you know, fairly big budget commercial, and I've not known any of the crew. And there's one time particularly, you know, Gaffer drove up with the, you know, lighting truck and the generator and everything, and he happened to just as I was walking into the location holding a coffee, he sort of rolled down the window, and I was like, oh, I'm going to meet my gaffer for the day, and he was like, you're right, mate, black, 2 sugars, please. Do you know where the TP is? So we kind of recovered after that. But, so yeah, it can be a bit awkward, and but you know, ultimately, you just have to not think about it and concentrate on doing a good job, I guess.
And how do you separate yourself? I mean, how do you establish yourself as a young DP in an industry that's perhaps got this conventional notion that a DP's got to be in his 50s and look like he's been through a few wars? And that's certainly a very valid, you know, in terms of experience, but is it difficult to establish yourself in this marketplace?
I think it depends on which part of the market you're talking about. If you're talking about feature films, certainly that's an issue, being younger. If you're talking about commercials, being older might be more of a disadvantage in some respects, because you can't, the agencies and all that, they want the young, trendy the flavour of the month DP, and they want to know that you're a director of photography. And it took me a number of years to kind of reconcile with that in my head, because I had come from working under an accredited cinematographer that I respected greatly, and I knew that with his 30 years experience that I'm not him. So how can I say I'm a director of photography the same way he calls himself that? But unfortunately, the market says that in commercials, they don't want to hire a lighting cameraman or a cameraman, they want to hire a director of photography. At the end of the day, I don't really care. You call me a runner, I don't, you know, I'll probably get you a coffee anyway. So, but, you know, that is the reality. So, no, I think certainly the approach you have will determine what you are, and that will be seen, your experience will be seen at the first creative meeting. That's what I've found.
So let's talk a bit about choosing camera formats. There's a lot of debate online, certainly in the kind of Vimeo communities and some of the sort of social media blogger websites about this camera's better than that camera. Now, I think it's fair to say we all know that's a load of rubbish. How do you go about, Ed, choosing a format for a job? Is that a decision that's made by the production, or is that something you can have a great deal of say in?
I'd say I have a great deal of say over it up until someone has to pay for it, like everyone, I guess. So, you know, my process, I'm relatively camera agnostic in that I think, you know, you should be able to produce nice images with almost anything over a very, you know, low set of standards. But, you know, you try and pitch them the best camera available purely, you know, sometimes I ask for the top cameras just because I know they're physically more robust and they're gonna survive kind of set life. But you know, we're sport for choice at the moment, you know, for kind of practical reasons. There's all kinds of cameras of different shapes and sizes that work well for particular situations. And I've found myself using different camera systems on the same projects, and that would be something that 2 years ago, I think that probably wouldn't have happened.
Well, let's talk about lenses and working with formats. Obviously, lenses, formats, lighting all go pretty much hand in hand, don't they? Do you have an ideal go-to kit, or does it very much depend on the job?
Certainly in terms of lenses, no. And, you know, I own camera equipment, but that's one thing I've kind of steered clear of. As much as a great investment it can be, lenses last forever. But the thing is, those are your optics. That's one of your tools, and you know, you want to use different lenses for different jobs. I did a job recently on the London Eye, actually, and you know, it was the eye keeps going. It's, you know, rotation of 30 minutes. You need to be in the right place at the right time for the light, you know, to work to whatever. And prime lenses just was not an option. So the best option really was to go with the zoom lens. There were certainly negatives because of the size of the kit that we were working with, made it a bit more cumbersome, but we were able to zoom in, crunch, grab some shots, get the cutaways that we needed, and we can move on. So definitely I look at, you know, lenses have their own character as well, and if you want to use that like you use your filters as a tool to create a look, then I think it's quite important just to kind of take each job as it comes. Don't just fix yourself to one style of lens or specifically prime lenses. You know, kind of have a think about the logistics of the job as well.
That's interesting. You've both actually mentioned practical reasons for choosing kit over necessarily just the image quality. Choosing zoom lenses over prime lenses, although you'd maybe get a better look from a prime lens, a zoom is more appropriate on the job. When it comes to talking about lighting, have you found using digital cameras really affects your lighting package?
Well, I should say that the number of times I've used film cameras can be counted on, well, one finger. So it's always been digital, but certainly the nature of that has changed I think the first digital camera I was using would have been like a Canon XL1, and that, you know, that seems like a very long time ago. And the range of choices you have now, you know, generally are a lot more sensitive. But I found that actually the extra sensitivity can cause as many problems as it solves for you. More often than not, there's a bunch of cameras out at the moment which are all around 800 ASA, and more often than not, I'd find myself with ND in all the time and almost wishing that they had or some of them do, had an ND wheel like kind of broadcast cameras, because it's just so sensitive. And often what I find myself doing in lighting is taking light away. It's just a much easier, quicker way of controlling contrast and feel. And if you have a camera that's as fast as 800 and you have prime lenses, and a lot of guys really like to get the DSLR prime lenses, which go crazy wide open, and a really sensitive camera. And at that point, just ambient light, which you would never have considered having to control previously, becomes an issue. So, if you're shooting a scene in a restaurant, maybe that 1.4 lens and the 800 ASA means you can actually do something with no lighting. But actually, if you're trying to produce a particular lighting control, suddenly all those little table lamps in the background, which might just be a little incidental kick on a slower speed camera, are suddenly actually lighting the background, and then you need to go around, taking all the 40-watt bulbs out, replacing them with 10-watt bulbs. So it kind of cuts both ways, but it's great to have the option.
And do you have a go-to lighting kit, or is it like anything, something that you choose?
Yeah, it's so budget dependent. I mean, when I can, I like to work with a generator, because then that gets you into the bigger lamps. And there's a gaffer I regularly use, and I have a running thing that we'd always rather just have one 18K on a cherry picker and no other lamps than we would have a whole bunch of smaller lamps. The more lighting I do, the more I find that the kind of in between lamps, the kind of 2.5Ks and 4Ks and 2K tungsten, they're kind of much less useful to me than a huge light further away and like a tiny bit of bounce in the foreground. So if I can, I go for the fewer big lamps. It's not always possible.
Talking a bit more about camera formats and codecs, is that something that you guys get involved in decision making about? Because if you're working with a 4 or 5K format, the data is huge and it can have a massive impact on post-production, which can take away budget from the front end. Is that something that you spend much time thinking about with producers, what format and what codec you're going to shoot on? Is that something that falls into your remit?
I think it does. I mean, the stage I'm at, the type of productions I do, tend not to have the budget for the sort of ideal post-process where maybe you'd be using raw data and you'd be, grading on set, and you'd be looking at, lighting to your grade as a kind of cool phrase, and then you'd have the whole post workflow. Because actually, even though you sort of read the stuff online and go, oh, you need some computers to do that, actually doing that kind of workflow and keeping up to a schedule is actually gets really expensive quickly. So the type of stuff I do tends not to have that luxury, and more often than not, I suggest to the production company that we kind of lock in a little bit more, that we kind of steer away from the raw. I'm interested in cameras now that can shoot a kind of log gamma space, but within a kind of video file format. So that's kind of a good best of both worlds for me. You can pull a lot more back in the grade. It's not hugely technically difficult to do that, but you're not dealing with the latest cameras which are shooting 2 terabytes of data a day, which you then have to back up into 2 separate locations, and suddenly that's become a huge enterprise grade data system just to do that.
And just to give us some perspective on what kind of budget productions you tend to be working on commercials?
The commercials I do, I think the highest budget commercial I've done is probably about 80,000, maybe a bit more. And at that level, we're using the sort of 4K cameras, the high-end digital cinema cameras. The 4K cameras, do tend to be raw by nature of how they work at the moment, but more often than not, I just try and get it converted into a video format. I try not to confuse. Again, there's all kinds of possibilities on set of having LUT supplied to monitors and looking at stuff, and again, without necessarily a huge team of technicians to make sure that's absolutely perfect and the director and the producer and I all agree on exactly what's being shown on that, I tend to just avoid that whole situation and just try and send a kind of, you know, Rec 709 image to the monitors and stick with that as much as possible.
Gareth, what kind of budgets are you working on?
Yeah, much the same as Ed, really. Obviously, that will also take in some post, and that can often dominate the budget these days, and the post companies will have a major say as to what format will be shot. I think the key thing is what I try to do is be as amicable as possible on trying to work with that, because that's where budget can blow out very easily. But at the same time, when you feel that there is a better codec, a better camera to be working with, I think you need to fight that battle, certainly with your producers. But again, you know, it does come down to budget that will deem it at the end of the day, and the post workflow that you're dealing with. If you're dealing with a big post house, then they can manage just about anything. They may have their preferences, but if you are dealing with a smaller operation, the director may end up editing a music promo, for example, and they'll be doing it on Final Cut or something, or some kind of major editing software on their laptop. It will be, certainly the limitations will be there on what camera. I have been in a situation where the director edited it, but his knowledge of the editing software was not particularly good, which I didn't know. He wanted to shoot something on a DV format with a 35mm adapter. I kind of felt, well, I may as well shoot on an affordable, you know, digital Cine Super 35 sensor camera. It'll be easier, and I don't need to muck around. And I helped him because my knowledge of the opening stage of the post, the codecs and what that is not too bad, so I was able to kind of guide him. But at the point at which I left him, something went awry in the whole post-production, and the colours looked all quite weird and not consistent, and I think the output was done incorrectly, and then you ended up with a product that's not really showreel worthy at the end of the day.
Well, that leads us on nicely actually to talking about your role in the process, and then the whole process, not just the filming, but going all the way through to the grade. How often of the time do you spend that you're actually booked and commissioned to be there during the colour grading process as well?
Yeah, it's kind of less and less. It depends on their budget. If there is a less budget and they can't take it through proper grading facilities, then they will probably do the quick path and apply looks, which can be very, very frustrating, and you don't really have too much say. You can try to guide. What I try to do is force a look in the shoot to try to get them seeing it that way. Once they become attached to it on set, it's very hard to kind of walk away. And I did one recently where we had a DIT on set. We went with a specific type of look. It was all changeable down the track. When we finally went into a major grading suite and worked on a look that the director felt he wanted to go with, we played around for a couple of hours, and at the end he kept referring back to the look that we did on set. And fundamentally it was a much better look, but it was something that I had to kind of instill in their minds very, very early, to try to, I guess, contain the situation, to be able to have some control later on, because graders can often feel that they want to create a wonderful look, but it might not really serve the purpose of the story. I'm a strong believer in that's essentially the thing that you're trying to shoot here is the story. So,
well, actually, that's the second time today we've heard the process of people shooting, and we heard earlier that they were shooting flat, and during the process of the edit, everybody got attached to that look. So, I was going to say to you, Ed, how important do you find it is during your role and your process to try and deliver the look up front, or to then make sure that you are stamped into being involved all the way through during the colour grading process to make sure your look is maintained?
Well, I think, as we said earlier, this is a really people skillsy job, and it's there are technical parts to that question, and there are communication skills, and it is very important. And I've had that exact. I shot a feature that was last year that was all shot intentionally, low contrast because of the camera we were using, and throughout the offline process, everyone got super used to it, and then when I came in, pulled all the blacks back down, everyone was tearing their hair out and going, "What have you done to it?" And that was, I came away from that thinking, well, actually, this is my fault for not communicating clearly what I was intending to do. And I think that there are endless technological systems you can. I was looking at one just the other day. It uses an iPad, an iPad screen. It calibrates it, and you can use that. And it, so that there's the very top end stuff. But I think even just as simple as taking reference stills, playing around in Photoshop. Making a kind of, like a mood board of the type of images that you want to do before you embark on a project, and kind of signing that off with everyone who's got a say on that kind of thing is really important, because then it's really easy to forget what you started off intending to do after 6 weeks of shooting. So yeah, I try and be in the grade as much as possible, but it's not always.
Well, as you say, it's communication, and I guess it's also being responsible to communicate your vision to all the departments, to your production designer, to make sure anything that's going to be in shot also works within the grade.
I think in the grade as well, there is, it's slightly unfair, there are some really, really fantastic colourists out there, but I think there is also a tendency when time is of the essence for colourists to kind of reach for the tools they know are kind of crowd pleasers in the suite. So up comes the vignette, up comes the extra contrast, up comes the sort of blue tint, and that's happened to me maybe once or twice. It's not been the standard thing, but I think but we all have that. We all know as DPs that if we don't have long to light a shot, if you kind of, you're never going to light it from the front, you're going to light it from here or from back here, and you're going to fill or something. There's things that you reach for, even if they don't necessarily, in the perfect world of the creative world of the film, fit in. But you do have to keep on top of that. Everyone has their kind of lazy moments, and if you want to keep a look through and make sure that everything you shoot isn't just, vignetted like Top Gear.
Let's talk about the somewhat sensitive subject of money, because we talk about budgets, and I think it's kind of this grand figure. But in terms of making a living and negotiating your rate, how do you find that part of the process? Because productions always seem to want to squeeze you. How do you negotiate your rates?
Well, first of all, I still have to. I mean, I think that maybe, I don't know about you, Gareth, but I think the next stage for both of us is getting the agent who does it for you, and then, but that takes a few big notches on your belt to be able to get to that point. So I do. The one rule I've found is that every time I put my prices up, it's worked out really well. The people who actually most of the time, people who I would expect to have said, "No, we've always done it at this rate, we can't possibly do that." Actually, if you've done a good job, we'll be like, okay. So it's about how people see you, because it's, cinematography, an image it's very difficult to say that that's objectively a better shot film than any other film. So it's all very much about the mind of the people looking at the stuff beyond a certain point. I think most DPs would do a really nice job of most TV shows or films. Everyone's going to make a technically. I'm actually amazed sometimes. I very rarely see bad cinematography on screens. It's generally, the standard is pretty high. Talking about films, high-end TV stuff. So how do you kind of differentiate yourself? I do think that the rate you charge plays a huge part in that. But you have to stick to it. Like we're talking about the route of coming up through the camera department. There's a thing in that tradition where once you stop loading and you take your first focus pulling job, you really shouldn't take any more loading jobs. Like once you decide that you've moved up a notch on the ladder, that's it. So it is a delicate one, and I don't have one rate that I charge for everyone. I more often than not I now start with the kind of BEC2 recommended rates or the APA rates for commercials, and then see where that gets me. But
I'm a great believer in being reassuringly expensive. And I don't mean that in a light-hearted way. I think if you don't charge enough, you're putting a message out to the client which says, potentially, well, you know, I can get 10 people that can charge me that. If you charge a bit more than the average, because we've had these discussions, there's a reassurance. You've got to be able to deliver, of course, but I think it's a given that we're all sat here and we actually deliver for clients. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I've actually fairly recently come to that same conclusion, that your rate is where you value yourself, and if you do value yourself at the APA rate, for example, it should be very easy to expect those rates and get those rates. You do have to think about the job though, because there are a lot of things like music promos or specific directors that you get opportunities to work with. They don't really have the budgets, and if you sit there being a little bit too stubborn about the rate that you want to charge and you expect, then you'll just miss out on the job, because there are, just as there are, you know, thousands of different cameras out there, plenty of DOPs out there they'll pick up the job for a quarter of what you wanted. So you just put it in perspective and weigh it up. More often than not, I'll go with the director or the job.
I agree. I've done that. Although there is something that I think has happened to all of us in the film industry, where if you are the guy that does the favour, you know, that cuts your rate, you probably weren't the first guy they called. You know, there was probably someone they really wanted. They really wanted Roger Deakins, and Roger Deakins said no, and they said, Ed Moore, will you do it for 20 quid a day? And you go, oh, okay then. And not that I pick up much of Roger Deakins' like leftovers, but actually what then happens is, weirdly, on the second job they do, they don't go, oh, let's reward that guy and let's bring the rate back up. Actually, as soon as either they want you on the same rate, or when their budget goes up, they go, oh, who's that guy we wanted the first time, Roger Deakins? And that's happened to me, like, enough that it's boring now. So, you know, there is some... DPs kind of make it on the coattails of directors, definitely, and if you know, if we're ever lucky enough to make it into the kind of higher ranks, then it's probably because you work with a director who gets a big break. So you definitely can't write people off. But you know, it's the same thing. Like, I'll do you a discount on the second job. Like, let's establish a working relationship first.
That's great advice, and I think it's also important to say no on occasions.
Yeah, I think in business in general, and that's what we're running. We're running our business. We are our business. You need to have a bottom line and stick to it.
Well, maybe moving on to a slightly easier topic to talk about. How about inspiration? Where do you draw your inspiration upon? We were talking earlier with Steve, and he drew a lot of inspiration from classical art and from photography.
I've always wanted to be able to say that. I mean, that's what you read in articles in American Cinematography. It's like, well, the first thing I did was went to the National Portrait Gallery, examined the, you know, play of light and dark.
I love your honesty.
Yeah, I can't. I mean, I do a lot of stills as sort of, I do get paid for it. It's more of a sort of hobby thing, and I do a lot of dance and theatre photography because I mean, I get inspiration from stills photography, kind of street photography and still life stuff like that, just purely because the type of lighting work that I kind of, if anything, have been sort of known for tend to be a more glossy, more produced look. That tends to be the sort of stuff that I get called for, and so I really admire kind of documentary street photography and really fantastic documentary cinematography, because it's just so far, you know, just making do with what exists. And in many cases, I think every DP has had the thing of, you know, you light something and then actually the correct lighting is to switch all of them off and then see what's just there. So, and obviously, I mean, the great DPs have mentioned Roger Deakins. He's a huge hero, but you know, all those top guys are, you know, every single time. Or Robert Elswit is another one. I watch one of their films. You get something more out of it, and you know, it's magical for me because it makes me realise like just how far up the ladder goes, and you know, in your sort of chosen craft, to think that you know, there are organisations such as the BSC and the ASC are so selective. Just is actually really encouraging for me, because if they let just anyone in, it would kind of spoil it. But the fact that there is just people who care enough about this kind of this work to be that selective is an inspiration for me. Well,
guys, you know, with the lights looking pretty gorgeous out there now, there's a beautiful sunset on the sky. We're running out of time. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you both. Thank you for sharing your insights, and I hope that we get to meet again and pick up this conversation some other time. So thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.